Listen carefully, because there is something about your current season that you may have misunderstood for a very long time. You may have thought you were simply waiting for something to change, waiting for the right person, waiting for life to finally feel different, waiting for that one connection that feels deeper than everything you have experienced before. But what if this season was never just about waiting? What if it was about becoming ready? The title of this message says something very specific. The person God chose for you is already on the way. And I want you to pause there for a moment, not because you should immediately assume that someone is secretly watching you, searching for you, or that a specific person is guaranteed to appear tomorrow, but because there is a deeper question hidden inside those words. Why would God allow you to spend so much time alone before bringing the right connection into your life? Why did some people leave? Why did certain relationships fail even when you desperately wanted them to work? Why did you meet people who seemed perfect at first, only to discover later that they were completely wrong for your journey? And why, after everything you experienced, do you still have this strange feeling that something has not arrived yet? Maybe you have felt it. You are surrounded by people, but somehow you still feel alone. You can talk to others, laugh with others, work with others. And yet there is a part of your heart that remains untouched. A part that says, there has to be more than this. Better. Maybe you've even stopped looking. Maybe you told yourself you don't need anyone. Maybe you learned how to become emotionally independent because depending on people became too painful. And perhaps that was necessary for a season. Because sometimes the first thing God changes is not your circumstances, it is you. Think about what happened to you over the last few years. You are not the same person you were before the disappointments. You don't trust the same way. You don't chase people the same way. You don't tolerate the same behavior. You notice things now that you once ignored. And perhaps most importantly, you have learned the difference between being wanted and being valued. That lesson did not come cheaply. It came through endings, through unanswered messages, through people who suddenly changed, through relationships that made you question your own worth, through nights when you wondered why everyone else seemed to find what you were still waiting for. But there is something I want you to understand. An ending does not always mean you lost. Sometimes an ending is simply an ending, and sometimes it creates space for something healthier to enter your life. This is where the title becomes more interesting, because perhaps the most important part is not the person. It is the phrase, God chose for you. That does not mean you should stop thinking for yourself or blindly accept every person who enters your life. It means something much more grounded. If your faith teaches you that God cares about the direction of your life, then you can also believe that meaningful relationships do not have to be accidents. Some people enter your life to teach you. Some enter to challenge you. Some enter to reveal what you should never accept again. And some may eventually become part of a completely different chapter. So maybe the question isn't, when will someone come? Maybe the better question is, who am I becoming before they arrive? Because imagine meeting someone at the exact moment when you are still carrying every wound from your past. You might push away someone good because you are afraid they will eventually hurt you. You might mistake consistency for boredom because chaos is what you became familiar with. You might question genuine care because manipulation taught you that kindness always has a hidden price. That is why preparation matters. Not preparation in the sense of waiting beside a window for a miracle. Preparation means healing, learning, growing, becoming honest with yourself, understanding what you want, understanding what you will no longer accept, and becoming capable of recognizing healthy love when it appears. Maybe that is why the waiting has felt so long. Not because you were forgotten, but because your story is not only about who is coming, it is also about who you are becoming before they arrive. If you've ever looked at your life and wondered why certain people had to leave before something better could happen, tell me honestly in the comments. What did your last difficult relationship teach you about yourself? You don't need to tell your whole story. Even one sentence is enough. Because sometimes the lesson we gain from the wrong person becomes the very thing that helps us recognize the right person. And there is another part of this that you may not have considered. The person who eventually enters your life may not arrive during the season when you are desperately searching. They may arrive during the season when you have finally stopped trying to force everything. when your attention has shifted, when your priorities have changed, when you have become comfortable with your own company, when you no longer need someone to complete you, but simply want someone who can walk beside you. That difference is enormous, because desperation says, "Please, don't leave me." Peace says, "If you stay, let it be because we both choose this." And perhaps your next chapter requires that kind of peace. So don't rush this moment. There is more to this story, because if this person really is part of the next chapter, there is a reason your previous chapter had to end the way it did. And once you understand that reason, some of your most painful memories may begin to look completely different. There is a reason we often understand our past only after we have moved beyond it. While you're inside the storm, everything feels random. The breakup feels random. The rejection feels random. The person disappearing feels random. The opportunity you lost feels random. But years later, you sometimes look back and realize, if that had worked out, I would not be where I am today. That realization changes everything. Maybe you've experienced something like that. You wanted someone badly. You prayed for the relationship to work. You tried to fix things. You gave more chances than you should have. And when it finally ended, you didn't immediately feel free. You felt empty. You wondered, why would God let me get attached to someone who wasn't meant to stay? That is one of the hardest questions, and there isn't always a simple answer. Sometimes people leave because people have free will. Sometimes relationships end because two people simply aren't compatible. Sometimes circumstances change. And sometimes, through faith, we interpret those endings as redirections. But whatever explanation you choose, there is one thing you can control: what you become because of it. Your pain can make you bitter, or it can make you wiser. Your loneliness can make you desperate, or it can teach you peace. Your disappointment can make you close your heart, or it can teach you boundaries. And that is where your story begins to shift, because perhaps the biggest preparation happening in your life isn't about attracting another person. It is about becoming someone who no longer accepts less simply because they are afraid of being alone. Read that again in your heart. You don't need someone simply because you are lonely. You need connection that is healthy, mutual, respectful, and genuine. That distinction will protect you, because when you desperately want someone to arrive, almost anyone can look like the one. A few compliments can feel like destiny. A little attention can feel like a sign. A strong emotional connection can feel like proof. But real compatibility reveals itself over time. Consistency matters, character matters, respect matters. How someone behaves when they are disappointed matters. How they treat people who cannot benefit them matters. How they communicate when things become difficult matters. And perhaps your previous experiences taught you to look beyond words. You learned to watch actions. You learned to notice patterns. You learned that someone saying "I care about you" and someone consistently demonstrating care are two completely different things. That wisdom is part of your preparation, and perhaps that's why you cannot go back to who you used to be. You have outgrown certain environments. Certain conversations feel empty now. Certain connections feel forced. Certain behaviors that once impressed you now make you uncomfortable. And you may have wondered, why am I changing so much? Maybe because your standards are changing. Maybe because your identity is becoming clearer. Maybe because you are finally learning what peace feels like. And when you learn peace, chaos becomes expensive. You no longer want it. This is why the person coming into your life cannot simply be someone who gives you attention. They need to bring something different, not perfection, not fantasy, something real. Someone who respects your growth instead of competing with it. Someone who doesn't make you question your worth every morning. Someone who can communicate. Someone who understands that love is not only emotion, it is patience, it is honesty, it is responsibility. It is choosing each other even when the excitement becomes ordinary. And maybe, just maybe, that is why you have been waiting. Not because you are being punished, but because the next relationship cannot be built on the same foundation as the previous ones. If this part connects with something you've been experiencing, you can write, "I am ready for something healthy." Not because you are trying to summon a person, but because you are acknowledging a decision within yourself. You are saying, I don't want the same cycle anymore. I don't want temporary attention. I don't want confusion disguised as love. I want something honest. And that brings us to an important question. How will you recognize the difference? Because if someone meaningful is entering your life, you need more than excitement. You need discernment. And the signs may not be dramatic. They may actually be quiet. You may notice that conversations feel natural. You don't feel like you're performing. You don't have to constantly prove your worth. You don't feel anxious every time they don't reply. You don't spend every night analyzing what their last message meant. There is room to breathe. There is room to be yourself. There is room for disagreement without disrespect. And perhaps the biggest sign is something very simple. You feel more like yourself, not less. That's powerful, because unhealthy connections often shrink you. Healthy ones give you space to grow. And there is another mystery we need to uncover. What if the reason you haven't recognized this person yet is because you are still looking for the wrong kind of evidence? What if you're expecting fireworks when the real sign may simply be peace? What if you're waiting for some dramatic moment when the actual beginning looks completely ordinary? A conversation, a meeting, a new environment, a friend introducing you to someone, a change in your routine, a person appearing in a place you never expected. Nothing supernatural has to happen for a meaningful connection to begin. Sometimes life changes through the smallest door, and that's exactly where the next part of this story begins. Because there may already be changes happening around you that you haven't connected yet. Pay attention to your life, not with fear, not with obsession, with awareness. Because sometimes change begins internally long before it becomes visible externally. You suddenly stop chasing certain people. You become less interested in proving yourself. You start protecting your time. You stop explaining your boundaries to people who repeatedly cross them. You begin enjoying your own company. And one day you realize, I'm actually okay. That moment matters. Because when you no longer need someone to rescue you from loneliness, you become much better at choosing someone who genuinely belongs in your life. This is where the title takes on a deeper meaning. The person God chose for you is already on the way. Maybe on the way doesn't mean a specific person is literally traveling toward you at this exact moment. Maybe it means your life is moving toward a moment where a meaningful connection becomes possible. Your choices are changing. Your environment may be changing. Your confidence is changing. Your understanding of love is changing. And all of these things affect who you meet and who you allow to stay. Think about it. If you remain exactly who you were 5 years ago, you may continue choosing the same kind of relationships. But when you grow, your choices change, your boundaries change, your expectations change, your entire definition of love changes. And suddenly someone who would have seemed boring to your old self may become incredibly attractive to your new self. Why? Because peace finally feels better than chaos. Consistency finally feels better than unpredictability. And genuine care finally feels better than emotional games. That's a transformation. And maybe the person you are meant to meet will recognize something in you that you couldn't recognize in yourself. Not because they are magical, but because sometimes another person sees our growth more clearly than we do. They may notice how much you've changed. They may respect the things you've survived. They may not need you to explain every scar. They may simply understand that you've been through enough to value something real. And this is where you need to be careful. Don't turn this message into a reason to obsess over every stranger. Don't start assuming that every new person is the one. Don't force a connection because you want the prophecy to come true. That's not faith. That's fear wearing spiritual language. Instead, stay grounded. If someone enters your life, observe, listen. Take your time. Let their character reveal itself. Let consistency speak. Let actions answer questions that words cannot. And if someone doesn't respect you, don't force them into a role they don't belong in. Sometimes the greatest sign that you're ready for a healthy relationship is your willingness to walk away from an unhealthy one. That is strength. And maybe you've already noticed something changing. Maybe you're not as emotionally attached to your past as you once were. Maybe a memory that used to destroy your mood now simply reminds you of how far you've come. Maybe you can finally think about that person without wanting them back. That's not emptiness. That's healing. And healing creates room. Room for friendship, room for love, room for purpose, room for something new. If you've experienced that kind of change, tell me one thing you've finally stopped chasing. Maybe it's a person. Maybe it's validation. Maybe it's an apology. Maybe it's the need to be understood by everyone. Whatever it is, naming it can be powerful. Because sometimes closing a door is not about hating what was behind it. It's about finally accepting that your future is not behind you. And there is something else you should remember. The person who becomes important in your next chapter may not look like the person you imagined. You may have created an image in your mind, a certain personality, a certain lifestyle, a certain appearance, a certain story. But life rarely follows our exact script. Sometimes the person who changes your life is not the person you were searching for. They're the person you never knew you needed. Maybe they challenge you. Maybe they teach you patience. Maybe they make you laugh again. Maybe they remind you that love can be simple. Maybe they encourage your dreams instead of making you feel guilty for having them. And maybe most importantly, they don't ask you to become smaller to keep them comfortable. That is the deeper preparation, not waiting for someone perfect. Preparing yourself to recognize something genuine. Because the greatest mistake you can make is confusing intensity with destiny. Intensity can happen overnight. Character takes time. Chemistry can happen instantly. Trust takes consistency. A powerful first conversation can make you excited. But how someone behaves 6 months later tells you much more. So when this person eventually enters your life, don't rush to label the moment. Let the story unfold. You don't need to force the ending in the first chapter. And perhaps that's the message you needed today. You don't have to chase what is meant to be healthy for you. You don't have to manipulate circumstances. You don't have to beg someone to choose you. You don't have to become someone else. You can grow. You can stay open. You can pray. You can use wisdom. And you can let time reveal what is real. Because sometimes the most beautiful part of a new chapter isn't the moment someone arrives. It's the moment you realize you are finally ready to receive something different. And there is one final piece. One realization that connects your past, your waiting, and the person you may eventually meet here is the part I don't want you to miss. The person coming into your life may be important, very important. They may become a friend, a partner, a mentor, a supporter, someone who opens a door, someone who introduces you to a new world, someone who walks beside you during a season you never expected. But don't make the mistake of believing that another human being is the source of your worth. They are not. Your life cannot begin when another person arrives. Your life is already happening. Your healing is already happening. Your purpose is already unfolding. Your growth is already real. And if God is part of your faith, then your relationship with God does not begin when another person enters the picture. It existed before them. That's why the healthiest way to receive this message is not, I need to find the person God chose. It is, I trust that what belongs in my life will become clear with time, wisdom, and discernment. Feel the difference. One creates anxiety, the other creates peace. One makes you search every face, the other allows you to live. And perhaps that is exactly what you have been learning. To live again, to laugh again, to make plans again, to dream again, to stop putting your entire future on hold because one relationship didn't work. Maybe the relationship ended, but your story didn't. Maybe the person left, but your worth didn't. Maybe the door closed, but your future didn't. And perhaps the person who eventually enters your life will meet a version of you that could only exist because you survived that previous season. They won't meet the person who was begging for attention. They'll meet the person who learned self-respect. They won't meet the person terrified of being alone. They'll meet the person who discovered peace. They won't meet someone desperately trying to be chosen. They'll meet someone who understands that being chosen means very little if the relationship is unhealthy. That's the transformation. And now the title makes sense in a completely different way. The person God chose for you is already on the way. Maybe the road to that person has been longer than you expected. Maybe there were wrong turns. Maybe there were endings. Maybe there were seasons where you thought nothing was happening. But something was happening. You were changing. You were learning. You were becoming more discerning. You were discovering what love should and should not feel like. And perhaps when the right person finally appears, you won't need to convince yourself. You won't need to manufacture signs. You won't need to chase. You won't need to lose yourself. There will still be imperfections. There will still be misunderstandings. There will still be ordinary days, but there will also be something different: mutual effort, respect, consistency, peace, and the freedom to be yourself. So if you're currently waiting, don't turn your waiting season into a prison. Use it as preparation. Build your life. Strengthen your faith. Take care of your heart. Learn your boundaries. Become comfortable saying no. Become comfortable saying yes. And most importantly, don't let disappointment convince you that your future has already been decided by your past. It hasn't. Your past explains where you've been. It does not have to dictate where you're going. Maybe the person is already on the way. Maybe the opportunity is on the way. Maybe the connection is on the way. Maybe the next chapter is closer than you think. But you don't need to know the exact date. You don't need the name. You don't need to force the timing. You simply need to remain awake to your own life. Because sometimes what you have been praying for doesn't arrive looking like an answer. It arrives as a conversation, a new environment, a new friendship, a new opportunity, a simple introduction, a moment you almost ignored. And suddenly you realize, this feels different. If you are entering that kind of season, write this in the comments: I am open to what is healthy for me. Not because you are trying to control the future, but because you are choosing not to close your heart because of your past. And if this message reminded you of someone who has been waiting, healing, or learning to trust again, share it with them. Sometimes one message arrives at exactly the moment someone needs encouragement. And before you leave, remember this: you do not have to chase love. You do not have to beg someone to recognize your value. You do not have to become perfect before you deserve something genuine. Keep growing. Keep your standards. Keep your wisdom. Keep your faith. And when someone new enters your life, don't ask only, is this the person I've been waiting for? Ask something deeper. Does this connection bring me closer to the person I am becoming? Because that question can protect your heart. And perhaps one day, when you look back at this season, you will understand why the waiting felt so long. You may realize that the delay was not the whole story. The story was everything that happened inside you while you waited. And then, when the right connection finally appears, you won't meet them as the broken version of yourself who needed to be rescued. You'll meet them as someone who has learned how to stand, someone who has learned how to love without losing themselves, someone who can receive without desperation, someone who can give without self-abandonment, someone who understands that a meaningful relationship is not the end of the journey. It is one beautiful part of it. So breathe. Don't force tomorrow. Don't reopen yesterday. Stay present, stay wise, stay open, and let life unfold one honest step at a time, because perhaps the person is already on the way. But the most important preparation was never about making them arrive. It was about preparing you to recognize something real when it finally does. And when that moment comes, may you have enough wisdom to recognize it, enough peace not to rush it, and enough self-respect to choose what truly deserves a place in your life. Your story is still moving. Your chapter is not finished. And whatever comes next,